To the state of Maryland, we researchers from the Chesapeake Bay have a policy proposal to make on the declining population of the eastern oysters. We recognize how much the state has done already, but we believe that greater efforts need to be made.
As I'm sure you are well aware, climate change is among us. The process of climate change is quickly impacting many organisms and ecosystems, including the eastern oysters who reside in the bay. Climate change is causing increased water temperatures for the oysters, which in return has caused many problems for the species. An increase in ocean temperature means more stress for the oysters as well as lower oxygen levels. Because ocean temperatures are increasing, the shellfish attempt to allocate more energy towards shell growth for protection as opposed to the growth of the meat, which is the part of the oyster that consumers eat. Oysters are a keystone species in the Chesapeake Bay. If oysters are to grow more shell as opposed to more meat, the part of the oyster that we actually eat, then consumers are not happy and sales in the shellfish will decline. It's important to note that oysters are cold-blooded, which means that they already require a lot more oxygen than usual. Additionally, oysters are sessile, which means that they cannot move on their own and are completely vulnerable to environmental shifts. This means that they have to rely on external factors to move to better conditions. Additionally, as carbon dioxide levels in the air rise, the inflow of fresh water into the Chesapeake Bay increases. As higher levels of salt water are introduced into the bay, the oysters become more prone to diseases. Research regarding oyster ecology was conducted recently by Smithsonian scientist Sarah Donlin. For her experiment, Donlin and a group of scientists created the Room of Doom, or the Room of Dissolved Oxygen Oyster Mortality. The Room of Doom is a dark room filled with aquaria where biologists mimic conditions in shallow Chesapeake waters. Donlin took 3,600 young oysters, each about 3 months old, and exposed them to 4 different tanks which represented 4 different scenarios. One tank had hotter water temperatures, one tank had lower oxygen levels, one tank had both hotter water temperatures and low oxygen levels, and one tank had neither. 900 oysters were placed into each tank. After 18 days of exposure, there was little to no change. However, around 60 days after initial exposure, Donlin placed the oysters again in each room for about 18 more days. After this time had passed, the environmental effects definitely changed the oysters. The growth of the actual meat in the oysters varied depending on the stresses it went through. Oysters that experienced hotter water temperatures or low oxygen levels were smaller than those that experienced neither, and oysters that experienced both of the stresses were the smallest of the batch. This goes to show how much climate affects oysters and their size.
So obviously the eastern oysters are important to the Chesapeake Bay. First off, they're keystone species, which means that they're part of defining an entire ecosystem, and the ecosystem can cease to exist without them. Within the ecosystem of the Chesapeake Bay, they provide habitat and food for small fish and crabs. They are prey for larger species, and they are prolific feeders, which means they help to remove algae that block the light from water and eliminate extra nutrients such as nitrogen. In the seafood industry, they provide a large income because of their popularity and also because of their health and vital micronutrients such as protein, minerals, and healthy fats.
U.S. researchers have looked into multiple policies we have seen incorporated into saving, especially oysters. First, we have solutions used by the state of Virginia, which also touches the Chesapeake Bay. To begin with, there is an oyster harvesting fee and limit. It works to limit how many people can buy it by either a random auction or giving back to a certain percentage of the same people each year, and it is annually distributed. This allows for seasonal flexibility in regards to the start and end date and makes tracking oyster harvesting much easier. Next, there are private permits and licensing. This requires people to obtain permits or licenses to set up private shellfish gardens. The purpose of this is to create better conditions for oyster growth as created by more intense regulations, limit the obtaining of contaminated shellfish, and reduce user conflict. There are also technological advancements. Thanks to modern day technology, there are highly detailed maps that track oyster harvesting along with their survival habitats. These maps make studying leases, fees, and permit areas much easier. It is also helpful for vessels that deliver and grow young oysters and tracking oxygen levels in the ocean. This is the most efficient way to regrow the oyster population as of today. In New Hampshire, a similar thing is happening to the oysters in Great Bay. The current solution they are using is conservationist program / pairing with other organizations. It works by educating volunteers on the oyster's habitat and survival requirements and allows them to take home oysters for private growth for a set amount of weeks. This is an ideal situation for video monitoring, constructing reefs, writing reports, and depositing juveniles onto said reefs. In conjunction with the University of New Hampshire's Laboratory in Private Aquaculture, this program is headed to do great things for oysters.
Although all the policy solutions have been beneficial to the states they have been implemented in, after extensive research, we have concluded that the best solution for Maryland to implement would be the oyster harvesting fee, followed by technological advancements. So with that being said, our short-term goal would be implementing the harvesting fee, like in Virginia, and it is a direct and immediate change that can benefit the eastern oysters. Maryland is still pretty relaxed on oyster harvesting guidelines, facing the highest numbers in years. This fee would allow the State Department to keep up with and better track how much oysters are being harvested and if there needs to be any changes to protect the population more. On the other hand, our long-term goal would be to purchase technology to upgrade maps and possibly a barge-type vehicle to deliver juvenile oysters to a sustainable habitat once they have grown to proper size. Maps can amplify the habitat restoration efforts already being made by the state, which means they would better target areas for efforts in survival. And then the barge would contain barrels with juvenile oysters to grow them to proper size to be released back into their habitat. This is beneficial to the entire ecosystem to find the balance again when a keystone species is restored. Thank you for listening and for your consideration for our research and policy recommendation. They need your help, and there are other ways to efficiently battle climate change, which has been shown by other states in our presentation.